What if I told you the most famous political takedown in history wasn't about armies or money? It was about a woman who ghosted the King of England. Seriously, this isn't just history. It's the ultimate reality show, and Anne Boleyn wrote the script, but she eventually paid the ultimate price. This is the story of the 6 years that changed England forever, all because one woman said no. Anne Boleyn was born way back in the early 1500s. No birth certificate, no public record, just silence. Her dad, Thomas, was a serious social climber, a true hustler. The Boleyn family wasn't royalty, but they were climbing that ladder, using charm and ambition as their currency. The Boleyn kids weren't just kids, they were assets. They were trained from childhood to marry up, or at least look fabulous trying. Her education started quickly, but her real glow-up started in France. She was shipped off to the continent, where she absorbed the high-stakes gossip, the power dynamics, and, most importantly, the style. She traded her English cottagecore for pure Parisian chic. Serving in the dazzling French court, she learned to speak French like a boss and serve up witty conversation. She was no basic blonde. Her appeal was that she was different, dark, expressive eyes, super smart, and always the most interesting person in the room. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, she was a poised, sharp, political weapon ready to execute her family's ambition. She was ready to slay. She had no idea she was walking right into the line of fire of the biggest player of them all. Henry VIII saw Anne's sister, Mary, as nothing more than a fun distraction, a royal side piece. But when he turned his attention to Anne, she did the one thing that blew up his world and changed history forever. She wasn't just playing hard to get, she was negotiating for a crown, and arrived back at the Tudor court fresh off the boat from France, and immediately saw the dynamics. Her own sister, Mary, was wrapping up her run as Henry VIII's mistress. Mary got a nice title, some gifts, and a quiet exit, and looked at that whole situation and thought, hard pass. That was the fast lane to being ghosted by the most powerful man in the kingdom. Henry VIII, the superstar athlete and monarch of England, was used to getting whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. And by 1526, he was obsessed with Anne. She was dark, she was witty, and she was uninterested. This was a combination he'd never encountered. Anne was smart. She knew she couldn't afford to be just another fleeting royal affair. She saw the bigger game. The king was desperate for a male heir, and his wife of nearly 20 years, Catherine of Aragon, had only given him a daughter, Mary. So, when Henry started sending her love letters, expensive jewelry, and private invitations, and did the unthinkable, she said no. She returned the gifts. She turned down the private meetings. She made it clear, with every polite, strategically cool rejection, that her price tag was not mistress, it was wife. Henry was absolutely stunned. His interest, which had been a casual crush, suddenly curdled into an absolute obsession. This wasn't just attraction. This was a challenge to his entire identity as an all-powerful king. And that obsession created the ultimate bombshell. Because he couldn't have, in any other way, Henry decided his long marriage to Catherine had to be null and void. He convinced himself, and tried to convince everyone else, that his marriage to his dead brother's wife was a sin in the eyes of God. He framed it as the king's great matter. But let's be real, it was the king's great crush. This wasn't a private affair anymore. This single, strategic no from Anne Boleyn didn't just snag a king. It snapped England's 1,000-year relationship with the Catholic Church, all because one man had to have the one woman who wouldn't be his side piece. By 1527, the stage was set. Europe was watching, the Pope was furious, and Henry was officially on the hunt for a divorce lawyer. And Anne, she was standing right in the eye of the storm. 7 years. That's how long Anne and Henry had to wait while the king's top lawyer, Cardinal Wolsey, struggled to get the Pope on the phone. This whole divorce process was a total headache, a logistical nightmare that dragged on for what felt like forever, and was blamed for all of it. People called her the homewrecker, the woman who dared to keep the king waiting. But Anne stayed focused. She didn't shrink under the pressure. She leaned into it. She started championing the radical new ideas coming out of Europe, religious reform, that conveniently argued the king should be the head of the church, not the pope. This was Anne's time to flex. She backed the reformers, and Henry loved it. It gave his selfish desire a high-minded, political purpose. Meanwhile, poor Cardinal Wolsey couldn't get the divorce done. For years, he kept telling Henry, "Any day now." But the Pope was not having it. Henry finally realized Wolsey was stuck in mud, and by 1529, the cardinal was unceremoniously fired and sent into exile. Henry had run out of patience. He decided to use the nuclear option. He bypassed the Pope completely. He appointed Thomas Cromwell as the new Archbishop of Canterbury, who was basically his ride-or-die guy, ready to grant that annulment. But they had a problem. Anne was pregnant. The only way to make sure the child wasn't labeled illegitimate, which would be a catastrophic fail for the whole Boleyn project, was to make it official and fast. So, in January 1533, in a secret, hushed ceremony, Henry VIII, Anne, and Boleyn finally tied the knot. England still didn't have a divorce, but Henry officially had a new wife. This was the moment of no return. Within months, Cranmer declared the marriage to Catherine null, and Anne's position as queen was sealed. Her coronation in June 1533 was a spectacle, the ultimate flex, showing everyone that the Boleyn girl was now the baddest queen in the land, and had won the crown, but the pressure was instantly intense. She hadn't just married Henry. She had married the entire future of the Tudor dynasty. She needed a boy, and she needed one now. In September 1533, the royal birth finally happened.
Is it a boy or a girl?
Push, my lady, push!
Almost there.
The anticipation was insane. Henry was convinced it was a son. But then the announcement came. It was a girl, Princess Elizabeth. The king was not happy. This was a major vibe check for the queen. Henry loved Elizabeth, sure, but she was still a girl, and had failed the assignment, the one and only job she had, and was a brilliant political queen, but her personality was a firecracker. She wasn't the sweet, agreeable wife Henry was used to. She argued with him about politics, she clashed with his friends, and she openly criticized his ex-wife's daughter, Mary, making the atmosphere at court incredibly awkward and divided. As 1534 dragged on, the cracks in the marriage started to show. Henry was now used to the new toy, and he started noticing other, less feisty women at court. The queen, feeling the heat, became even more desperate. She focused on securing Henry's religious reforms, knowing her power was tied to the break with Rome, and was a queen, but she was a queen on a ticking clock. Henry had already proved he was willing to obliterate a 20-year marriage and an entire church just to get what he wanted. If and couldn't deliver the one thing he cared about, a healthy son, she was going to face the cold, hard reality of Henry's short attention span. The real downward spiral began in 1535. Henry, tired of Anne Boleyn's political opinions and still airless, started showing serious interest in a quiet, meek new lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour. And Boleyn knew immediately. Game over. This was exactly how her sister Mary had started, and she knew the cycle. Then came the tragedy. In January 1536, and Boleyn suffered a devastating miscarriage. The fetus was reportedly dead. This was the moment Anne's fate was sealed. Henry looked at this failure, coming just 3 years into the marriage, and his mind went back to his old excuse. God was punishing him. He needed a villain, a scapegoat, and a clean exit. The pressure on Henry to produce a son was intense. The future of England depended on it. Enter Thomas Cromwell. This guy was Henry's other political hustler, a fixer who had helped him rise by getting rid of Wolsey. But Cromwell was pragmatic. He saw Henry's desperate eye for Jane Seymour. He saw the king's conviction that Anne was cursed, and he saw a problem that needed eliminating. He knew Anne was a political liability, and he was ready to switch sides. The irony is incredible. The same political mastermind who got Anne the crown was about to take it away. Cromwell had to figure out how to get rid of a queen who hadn't technically done anything wrong. Divorce was messy and slow. They needed something fast. They needed treason. The scheme Cromwell cooked up was absolutely wild. It was a total setup, orchestrated with dizzying speed. First, Cromwell and his allies started sniffing around, looking for any scrap of evidence. When they couldn't find any actual political treason, they had to get creative. They accused Anne Boleyn of adultery and, unbelievably, incest with her own brother, George Boleyn. Think about that. They didn't just want to get her out of the way. They wanted to destroy her reputation completely. The charges were so unhinged, so lacking in actual evidence, that they defied belief. They arrested a musician named Mark Smeaton, a young man who was tortured until he confessed to having an affair with the Queen. They arrested 3 other courtiers, Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, and William Brereton, all of whom were close friends of the King and Queen. In May 1536, Anne Boleyn herself was arrested and taken by barge to the Tower of London. She was stunned, repeatedly insisting, "I am the Queen. I am no common woman." The trial that followed was a sham, and Boleyn was brilliant in her defense.
I stand before you, not to beg for mercy, but to proclaim my innocence.
Arguing logically and passionately against the ridiculous charges. But the fix was in. The jury was packed, and her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, was the one who presided over her conviction. And Boleyn was found guilty of high treason. The sentence? To be burned at the stake or beheaded, depending on the king's mercy. For Henry, it was no evidence, no problem. All that mattered was the marriage to Jane Seymour could happen immediately. Anne's last days were spent in the Tower, where she moved with a grace and dignity that baffled her jailers. She was not hysterical. She was composed. She knew the game was over, and she decided she would take the high road in her exit. Henry, in a weird show of mercy, sent for a professional French swordsman instead of the usual axe, ensuring a quick and clean death. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn, aged around 35, walked out onto the scaffold. Her final speech was a masterpiece of political diplomacy, a total mic drop. She refused to incriminate anyone or rail against the king. Instead, she spoke simply and calmly.
To God I commend my soul,
Stating, "I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor more merciful prince was there never." This was a genius move. By praising him, she ensured the executioners didn't mess up and, more importantly, that her daughter Elizabeth would be safe. She then knelt and quietly waited. One swing of the sword, and the tumultuous life of Queen Anne Boleyn was over. The aftermath was chillingly fast. Henry was so impatient. He was already hunting and planning his next wedding. Anne's body was dumped unceremoniously into a cheap, unmarked chest. Less than 11 days later, King Henry VIII married Jane Seymour, and Boleyn had traded her life for a daughter. And while she was quickly erased from history by the Tudor spin machine, that little girl, Elizabeth, would grow up to be one of the most powerful and iconic monarchs England ever saw, and may have lost the battle, but her legacy ultimately won the war.